In this lesson, we will describe the demographic, ethnic, and social character of Britain's colonies in the 18th century and show how colonial society has changed during the 17th century. From 1770 to 1775, the population of England's North American colonies increased from under 300,000 to 2,500,000. Of those 2.5 million, nearly 500,000 were African. This was a very large rate of growth in contrast to the slow growth that had taken place from 1610 to 1700. In 1700, approximately 50% of the colonists were English, and these people had a distinctly colonial profile rather than just a purely English one. In 1790, the percentage of English to other ethnicities remained about the same. The growing population of American colonists, which doubled every 25 years, had political consequences for England's relationship with her colonies, and it was marked by a growing shift in the balance of power. In 1700, the ratio of English citizens to American colonials was 20-1. By 1775, that ratio had dropped to just 3-1. The map below shows where different ethnicities, people coming from Europe, actually settled. You can see who settled in Philadelphia, who settled in the Chesapeake region, and then who settled in the southern colonies. Nearly all the colonists in British North America in 1700 lived within 50 miles of the Atlantic seaboard, which means along the coast shown here. They were hemmed in between the Atlantic Ocean and a vast wilderness that was inhabited by Native Americans, trappers, and traders. By 1775, American colonials were moving beyond the foothills of the Appalachians into the Kentucky and Tennessee regions of the Ohio River Valley. By that year, German immigrants made up nearly 6% of the population, settling primarily in Pennsylvania's backcountry. German immigrants, whom the English referred to as the Pennsylvania Dutch, were primarily Lutherans, and they were fleeing religious persecution, economic oppression, and the effects of war. If you look at the map below that shows settlement by ethnic groups, you'll see that the English, the Scots-Irish, the German, the Dutch, and African all made up the population in the colonies, and they were settled between the Atlantic Ocean, seen here, and the Appalachian Mountains, which would be about here. The Scots-Irish, who began immigrating to America in the early 1700s, made up approximately 7% of the non-English colonial population. The Scots-Irish, planted in Ireland by Elizabeth I to help govern that country, did not prosper there and were resented by Irish Catholics for their Scottish Presbyterianism. They settled all along the Appalachian frontier, from Georgia to the American colonial population, and was comprised of Swedes, Swiss, Welsh, Dutch, Scots, Highlanders, French Huguenots, and other European peoples south to New York in the north, areas which were as far from English authority as they could safely be. They were frontiersmen, individualistic and lawless people with no love for government, an image reinforced by the Paxton Boys in Pennsylvania and the Regulator movement in North Carolina. In 1764, the Paxton Boys led an armed march on Philadelphia to protest the colony's lax English policies. In 1771, the Regulator movement became a small-scale civil war started by Scots-Irish farmers in the backcountry against local sheriffs, tax collectors, and Eastern domination of the colony's affairs. One of these protesters was Andrew Jackson, who would become a future president of the United States, seen here. French settler Michel Guillaume de Crevière described this mingling as a strange mixture of blood, which you will find in no other country. Essentially, this was creating a new American. Over time, these various immigrant groups mingled and intermarried, producing a uniquely American identity, unlike anything in Europe. Those motivated enough to work hard could move up the social economic ladder and make themselves a better life. 18th century America was a land of equality and opportunity, with no titled nobility dominating it from above and no poor underclass threatening from below, with the exception of the African slaves. Most white Americans and some free blacks were yeoman farmers, using their own labor to till the land. In the cities, there was a growing class of skilled artisans, along with shopkeepers, tradespeople, and unskilled laborers. However, in contrast to life in the 17th and early 18th century, colonial society on the eve of the Revolutionary War showed signs of a beginning social stratification, one with a growing class of economic and social elites. Among the first elite classes were merchants in New England and middle colonies who served and who were involved in trade as military suppliers, who took advantage of armed conflicts by selling weapons and other supplies. These merchant princes accumulated fortunes that provided them with money to buy fine houses, expensive clothes, English china, and other trappings that showed they were wealthy. Among those enjoying positions of prestige and honor were Christian ministers. They did not, however, wield the influence that they once held in 17th century colonial America. Those calling themselves doctors usually apprenticed under older practitioners and adopted techniques little advanced since the days of ancient Rome, including that of bleeding to remedy illness. Physicians, often poorly trained, did not enjoy the same social prestige. They typically proved unable to prevent or cure periodic epidemics of smallpox, diphtheria, scarlet fever, malaria, measles, and other deadly killers. You can see in the picture here, a quack doctor is represented, a doctor who basically doesn't know what he's doing and can't really cure anything. And that was sometimes the impression of doctors during the late 17th, early 18th century. Lawyers were also not highly esteemed in 18th century America. They were viewed as windbags and ranked alongside drunks, at least until the celebrated John Peter Zenger case came along in 1734 to 1735. John Peter Zenger was a German-born printer, aged 38, who gained a landmark victory in his court case for freedom of the press. New York Governor William Crosby had brought libel charges against Zenger for reporting that Crosby attempted to rig a 1733 election held at St. Paul's Church Village Green in the town of Eastchester. Philadelphia lawyer Andrew Hamilton admitted that his client printed the report in his New York Weekly Journal as charged, but he persuaded the jury that Zenger only printed the truth and was telling the truth the whole time, and he was acquitted for that. By the mid-18th century, prominent individuals and families came to expect and receive preferential treatment, even churches and schools where they were seated according to social rank. The numbers of poor people, including victims of war and death, such as widows and orphans, remained low, particularly in comparison to Old England, where approximately a third of the population was impoverished. This forced younger sons and daughters either into towns and cities, where they sold their labor for wages, or to move beyond the Appalachian Mountains, where land was cheaper and the danger of Indian attacks was constant. In the 1730s, cities like Philadelphia and New York built almshouses to care for widows and orphans, those least able to survive without public charity. In New England, where farms shrank drastically in size over time because of the subdivision among surviving heirs, many farms could no longer support succeeding generations of growing families. Ranking below indentured servants were those considered undesirable riffraff and jailbirds, which included approximately 50,000 criminals, robbers, rapists, murderers, and others. In the South, wealth was concentrated in the hands of the great merchant planters who owned a large number of slaves, widening the gap between them and poor whites. In the 18th century, a continuing flow of indentured servants swelled the number of those in society's lower economic ranks, a fact true of all of England's North American colonies. Finally, at the bottom of colonial society came African slaves, who had little chance of escaping their condition, enjoying any sense of equality, or seizing opportunities to advance economically or socially.